Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. The following is an interview I conducted with Katka and Hazel, both of whom live in the UK, and were recently back from Bakur, a portion of Kurdistan within the borders of Turkey. For 2 hours, the guests spoke about the political violence of the Erdogan ruling AKP party, suppression of the Kurdish movement, electoral strategies, democratic confederalism, political prisoners in the F-type prisons in Turkey, the earthquakes from earlier in the year, widespread corruption, and other topics. We hope you enjoy the conversation. A transcript of this interview will soon be available at our website. A couple of quick announcements. If you missed the ACAB book fair or any of the workshops, we've got a happy surprise for you. Give a gander over the next week to acabookfair.noblogs.org for the media page that will soon appear and be populated with audio recordings from some of the presentation events on various topics. More likely than not, some of those will end up in future episodes of The Final Straw, FYI. Also, the latest episode of Bad News from the A Radio Network is up now at their website, but also linked in the show notes. You'll hear from contributing members of the A Radio Network sharing perspectives at the 2023 Serêkaniyê gathering in Switzerland on the importance of the audio medium like radio and podcasts for the building of anarchist movement. You can also find links in the show notes for this episode to the live broadcasts from throughout the weekend via Radio Ria and some video presentations and audios of some of the workshops in German, Spanish, French, English, and Italian. Maybe even one or two in Esperanto for you spicy people.
Hey, so I'm Hazel and I'm from England. I'm based in Scotland. I use pronouns she, her. And I'm a internationalist connected to the Kurdish freedom movement and a organizer in other contexts.
Hello, I'm Katka. I use pronouns she, her. I live in Bristol. I'm a lecturer in politics at the University of Bath, and I organize with Kurdistan Solidarity Network and BASE, which is a base for anarchy and solidarity in Eastern.
Great. Thank you so much. So we're going to be speaking about somewhat about the political situation in southeastern Turkey, the region of Kurdistan known as Bakur, and the recent Turkish elections there. First, would you tell us a little bit about your relationship and interest in the area and kind of the scope of the recent trip that you were on?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just start by saying what drew me to the Kurdish movement. I actually primarily was really inspired by how patriarchy is conceptualized as a more than 5,000-year-old power system. And there's a very, very rich theory and ideology behind it that actually expands into not just how to analyze one system of power, but how to analyze all systems of power and also organize life according to a kind of, in my opinion, very beautiful politics that I think has quite pertinent lessons for our own context, and also as a movement is one that's very welcoming to internationalists, and actually since the beginning has always been an internationalist movement, as well as being now quite like a critical revolutionary struggle for across the world, as well as this continent that we're living on. So yeah, I'm very inspired by the movement and the ability to be able to connect to it. And I'll pass over to Katka now to mention a bit about herself too.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I got in touch with the movement and more organizing with that because of the political project. So I've been always fascinated in my activism, but also academic work with how should we structure democracy? What is grassroots democracy? And when I started learning about Rojava and Kurdistan freedom movement and looking at, wow, someone is really trying to put in practice all these wild political fantasies that we have. So yeah, I was quite hooked, and yeah, this is where my journey started. And yeah, then we started doing these like delegations to Bakur. I guess Hazel will say more about it. And yeah, and that's how I joined. And also personal thank you to Hazel, because she's one of the people who helped me to join.
So on this trip that we just did, we joined as international observers for the elections that just happened in May. And we also joined the campaign of Yeşil Sol Party, which means Green Left Party. And they're like a continuation of another sort of primarily, but not exclusively, Kurdish party in the region called the HDP. And they every year call for election observers to try and record the anti-democratic practices of the state. So we joined these, and I was there for 5 weeks and witnessed various forms of intimidation, anti-democratic, for example, military intimidation, and this kind of thing, which we can talk a bit more about later. But alongside all of that, we actually joined a very interesting grassroots campaign spread into local villages and towns and also like cities in the southeastern region of Turkey, which is in northern Kurdistan. And this is generally called Bakur, which just means north. And we might use some of these words interchangeably during the podcast.
Cool. That's very helpful. This is an anarchist show, and we rarely discuss the outcomes of elections. But I'm interested in this conversation so that I can learn more about the ramifications for democratic confederalist projects in the area. Listeners to the show may be familiar with organizing in the autonomous administration of Northeast Syria, or Rojava, but maybe haven't heard much about what's been happening across the border in Turkey, where you just were on this trip. I guess, could you give a kind of, this is a big question, but could you give a quick and dirty explanation of the Bakur roots of the Rojava revolution and the related entities, or the entities that are often put in relation, the PKK and the KCK?
Sure. So this is a really amazing question, and also an enormous one. Because the history of that area in relation to the Kurdish freedom movement, not just the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, but actually the entire struggle, that area in particular is actually where it was born. So we're kind of talking in a narrow sense of 45 years of history, but actually we're talking of hundreds, if not thousands of years of history that we can't kind of create a clear starting or end point in terms of how things relate to each other. But I will do my best to explain at least the last 100 years in a very quick rundown, where to give a little bit of context to the conditions that gave birth to the PKK, but also the wider movement itself, which is not just a party. Firstly, we can start from the fall of the Ottoman Empire and how Kurdistan itself is split into 4 different nation states. So we're talking about the area that's inside Turkey, but also in Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And the border with Iran has actually been ongoing more or less unchanged for about 400 years, whereas the other borders have all changed a lot in the last 100 years. And there's around 20 million Kurdish people in Turkey, but we can't say exactly how many. And the formation of this nation state was basically created in 1923, or through a kind of process of a few years in that period, between Western Russian imperialist powers who basically navigated the end of the empire and then the integration into the nation-state world system. So the Treaty of Lausanne, which actually had its 100-year anniversary of signing on the 24th of July, so just a few days ago, is kind of the legislative formation of this. And we can see that the nation-state building process happened very harshly in this period, as it has also everywhere in the world. And that means one language, one flag, one nation, religion, culture is extremely homogenized and centralized into one acceptable format, which of course creates, at best, extreme inequality, and at worst, and more commonly the case, genocides and extermination of other ethnicities, religions, etc. And just preceding the Treaty of Lausanne, more than 1 million Armenians were killed in the genocide that directly preceded the creation of the state. And actually, that treaty basically created the conditions to never have to acknowledge or be accountable for this genocide. And if we focus again on the Kurdish resistance, so since the beginning of the Ottoman Empire, actually, the Kurdish people, but also all people that were not able to be homogenized into the identity of Turkishness, resisted very strongly against this form of oppression. And in the 1920s and 1930s, there was quite a lot of tribal, clan-based resistances against the state military and against the massacres that they inflicted upon people. And actually, some of the clan leaders who led these uprisings are even today very famous and important figures in this history of resistance against the state policies of extermination. And these were primarily in the Kurdish areas. So also, for example, Said Riza in Dersim in the 1930s, he is a really important Alevi Zaza person who led one of the uprisings and paved the way for a lot of the, not just like sort of practical, it's not about like practical format of struggle, but actually like the spirit of resistance, cultural and like political consciousness that is ongoing for generations. And then for a couple of decades, there was much less resistance, very harsh conditions all over the country for all peoples. And in that period, up until the 60s, people in the movement kind of say it's like the lost years of like Kurdish consciousness. Up until the 60s and 70s, where all across the world, there was a huge uprising of the struggle for socialism. And this particularly took place in the form of national liberation movements. So against colonialism, against capitalism. And some of the main ideological formats that took is Marxism, Leninism, and also Maoism. And that is the case across most continents. So actually the Kurdish struggle came out of the Turkish left, which was massively influenced by those ideologies. And they kind of inherited a lot of their practical and ideological DNA, I guess, from those forms of socialism. And with the PKK specifically, I want to just say, like, it wasn't the only party that was sort of being formed in that period. There was a lot of different Turkish left groups, also that Kurdish people, Laz people, Armenians were also involved in, and some of those groups are still active today. It was mostly young people, students, people who went from very rural areas into cities, and they formed armed groups and had a anti-imperialist lens. And a lot of the way that these groups would be organized is through quite a centralized way of, a centralized format. So like a party, military, and united front strategy, basically, which actually for some decades is the format that also the PKK used. But so in the 1970s, of the blowback of the 1968 student movement, the founding members were mostly university students coming out of the Turkish left, and there was a huge power struggle within Turkey in general at the time as a state. So there was huge armed fascist forces, there was extreme economic upheaval, there was a kind of fragile political power in terms of the state itself, and a lot of different groups that actually, a socialist group then actually could have taken power. It was actually a possibility of a regime change. And in those days, the early members of the PKK, basically before it was officially formed, learned from this Marxist-Leninist ideology and going back to the rural areas that people came from and going basically door by door, talking to families, talking to their own community members, and also many, many people that they didn't know, hundreds, thousands of people, and learning about the conditions that people actually faced. What actually were the problems? What were the conditions that people were living in under the colonization of the Turkish state? And a very radical idea at the time formed, which is that Kurdistan itself is a colony. And at the time, the Turkish left also conceptualized itself in opposition to the Western imperialist forces. So Turkey was seen as a kind of anti-imperialist force. But to say that then Kurdistan is a colony, it was like a colony within a colony. And this caused actually a lot of friction within the left and a lot of splits. But even from the very early days, the PKK itself, when it formed in 1978 and just before that, was always internationalist. So, for example, Kemal Pir, who was one of Öcalan's closest friends and organizers, was called Laz Kemal because he came from the minority ethnic group of the Laz people. And Haki Kara actually was Turkish, and Abdullah Öcalan is Kurdish. So we can even see then in the very, very early days that it's not just a, ethnically homogenous national liberation project, but actually something that already had a broader and participatory liberatory ideology. But we can definitely say that it organized according to this democratic centralism. And in 1980, there was a military coup, which was a very harsh time for all of the left wing and the entire population. So about 500,000 people were imprisoned, quite a few people were executed, and all forms of non-Turkish culture were completely banned. That would include national dress, language, dancing, saying that you're not Turkish if you're a Turkish citizen. All of these things were very, very, very harshly criminalized. And they were already criminalized before this, and people already faced extreme assimilation policies and genocide. But this was a kind of fracturing of the political structure where the military coup also symbolized a desire for parts of the establishment to actually go more in line with the IMF and the World Bank, because they wanted to have a more neoliberalist economic policy, and they wanted to open up Turkey as a bigger export market for the world. And then during this period, in the 1980s, the movement, the PKK, basically split into three directions. So the vast majority of people went to prison, like the vast, vast majority. A smaller group went to Bekaa Valley, which is in Lebanon, and the PKK early guerrilla fought against the Israeli occupying forces in the Palestinian refugee camps alongside the PFLP and the DFLP. And also a small percentage of the PKK cadre of the time went to the mountains. In this period as well, one of the biggest ideological, practical, political threads of the DNA of the party and also of the entire movement is prison resistance. So because most of the cadre of the time were imprisoned, they learned how to resist in a very harsh prison condition. And a lot of the prisons were replaced by military rule. So rather than civilian prison officers, they would have soldiers there. And people were tortured very, very harshly, sometimes to death. And this would go all types of torture, not just physical, but to try and break the spirit of the people and also their organization. So this also included the restriction of outside materials, contact with family members, etc., as well as very, very harsh physical forms of torture. And there was a lot of resistance against this. So people self-immolated, there was hunger strikes, death fasts, but also there was a lot of collective organization. So, for example, any outside material that could be gained, some of which was gained through the struggle, such as being allowed magazines or newspapers, there would be then collective forms of discussion, political education, and self-organization of basic necessities. And also some of the things that are still remembered today, not just in the PKK, but actually also in the society, is, for example, the self-immolation of some of the prisoners. And this is really symbolized by Newroz, which is the sort of start of the new year. It's actually the spring equinox. And this is a fire festival, anyway, traditionally. And one of the leading, at the time, PKK cadre self-immolated on this day. And yeah, through this very harsh conditions, it kind of lasted through the 80s, but also the 90s, many people were still imprisoned. But outside of this, outside of the prisons, many family members also got involved in the struggle through this process. And in 1984 was the beginning of the armed struggle against the state and against the collaborationist class of the Kurdish clans as well. So I think this is very important to point out that it was never only against the ideology of the state itself, but also against the people that betray values of freedom and are in collaboration with the state. And yeah, this was the start of the protracted People's War. In the 90s, there was between 3,000 and 4,000 village burnings in the area of northern Kurdistan, but this also happened extensively in the 80s and 90s in Bakur, which is the Iraqi part of Kurdistan. And this was basically like a scorched earth strategy and like a forced displacement. So this was obviously a purposeful strategy by the state to try and break what they called the separatist movement, and also to force the like predominantly rural and agriculturally reliant people, agricultural way of life, into a forced urbanization. And this would break the family bonds, the connection to place, identity, and also, as we can still see today, many military bases were set up in these areas as well, on top of hills, in the mountains, and as this kind of really extreme form of like a penetration of the homeland of people by the occupying forces. And military still intimidate people now, as we saw. And also throughout this period, the women's resistance really grew. So since the beginning, there's always been women members of the PKK, and Serêkaniyê is the most famous woman who co-founded the party and also led a lot of the resistance in the prisons and also in the guerrilla. But also in the 90s, thousands of women joined, and they had autonomous military units and also created their first women's congress. But at this point, the movement was still primarily focused on the military, although of course there was like a lot of family support. Thousands and thousands of young people were joining the struggle, and the older generations also, although they may not necessarily have joined in that way, there was a huge support for the movement that was growing every year. And there was many famous people who were killed by the state, women as well as men, and their death often led to further actions. And also the development of the philosophy of the organization developed here. So it wasn't just like, how do we organize effectively militarily, but also a philosophy in terms of the question of how to live. Also in this period, a lot of the mass movement began. So in the 90s still. So a lot of mass uprisings, especially at the funerals of the martyrs, the people who were killed in the struggle. These would often cause huge uprisings because the state would come and attack the funerals. They would attack the people carrying coffins, they would attack the funeral goers, and some state institutions were even burned down in the struggle when that would happen. And a lot of legal and cultural associations also began. So television broadcastings and Kurdish media, for example. And also the development in terms of what is the primary contradiction that we're being faced with within this whole system of this like world order, within capitalism. What is the primary contradiction? Because Marxist-Leninist ideology is based on class as the primary contradiction. That is how it had been, how the PKK had been formed up until that moment. But then actually women's position began to be shifted into the center of the struggle. But there was never like an exclusion of one category for another. And even then, there's this constant analysis of class, industrialism in the city, clan society, the role of women, revolutionary organizing in society, the family, religion, etc. So this would generally also be through like political education, not just actually of the party, but also within society. And in the 1990s, we also saw the fall of real socialism of the USSR. And this was one of the factors among many others that created this very deep period of change in the PKK and this restructuring. And also in that period, Abdullah Öcalan, who is the ideological, philosophical leader of the movement, was captured through various international states' cooperation, and he was sentenced to death in prison. Death sentence. And then it was transmuted to life imprisonment because the death penalty was abolished. And since then, he's been in solitary confinement on a prison island in Raleigh. And many, many, many people say that the isolation of Öcalan is the isolation of all of Kurdish society, which we can also see with how the prison system is developed, but we'll get to that later. And through his imprisonment, he wrote many books, which he wrote defenses in court, which later were written by legal professionals when he was in court defending himself. And that was created, it was reproduced as books. And from these writings, as well as all of the previous experiences, contradictions, struggles with the state mentality, patriarchy, dominance and centralism, all of these things have been experienced within the party and within the movement more broadly, the contradictions with society. And Öcalan kind of condensed them and then gave a series of solutions through a huge paradigmatic shift in the ideology. And through that is where the more well-known ideas around democratic confederalism and also democratic nation and democratic autonomy have come about. So to kind of briefly try and break down some of that jargon, democratic confederalism is basically like the governance structure. Democratic nation is kind of like the social spirit, maybe we could say, with which these things should be carried out, the way to conceptualize like a people's. And also democratic autonomy is like the kind of analysis of like the necessity for freedom and how to break down this contradiction between, for example, the individual and the collective, or between, it's like the kind of individual spirit for trying to find freedom and like truth in all forms of life can be in harmony with like a much bigger apparatus or like coordination between many different points. And also through that, KCK or KCK is basically the Congress structure, or it's basically like the political organ through which those things can be organized. So through the early 2000s, there was a lot of neighborhood communes being developed, which, we'll get to also a bit later, a relative flourishing of civil society organizations in the region, and the setting up, for example, of a more organized form of people whose family members have been killed by the state. For example, prisoner confederations within the prisons and outside of the prisons, the media, and also actually political, like parliamentary parties also actually existed throughout this time period as well, as a kind of, another bit in the ecosystem. Then in the kind of like mid 2000s, there was a peace process. So a dialogue between Erdogan and like the ruling party, the AKP, and Öcalan, and also the wider different democratic structures of the movement that were proliferating at that time. So there was a kind of easier form of organizing. And also in 2012, HDP, which we just mentioned as parliamentary party, was actually created, and they were quite successful in the following years. In 2015 to 16, basically, we have the period of the city wars, where a lot of the youth across several different cities and towns in Bakur rose up against the constant military and police harassment and attacks that were happening in their neighborhoods. And they tried to create autonomous areas. So they were digging trenches to try and stop the armed military vehicles and tanks from coming into their neighborhoods. And they defended it with arms. And unfortunately, this was very brutally suppressed by the Turkish state. And close to half a million people were displaced. More than 3,600 people were killed, and entire neighborhoods were destroyed in a lot of areas, which we can also see now in, for example, in Ahmed and Diyarbakir. The area of Cerr is now being really exploited by different companies, capitalist gentrification in the most extreme and disgusting way. Many extremely horrific things happened in the city war period. Like people couldn't take their family members who were killed in the streets because there were snipers that would have shot them. Basements where hundreds of civilians were sheltering, were burned by the soldiers. A female guerrilla's body was like dragged naked and posed for with Turkish soldiers. Like while she was naked, they stripped her naked and then took photos with her dead body. And, really disgusting, like patriarchal colonial attacks. And also in the same period, there was an attempted coup. So not by PKK or actually anything to do with the Kurdish movement, but by a different part of the semi-state, semi-non-state actors. And intense waves of repression followed this, where thousands of dismissed teachers, lawyers, state workers of various kinds were, forced out of their work, imprisoned. Many people fled the country. And since then, this repression has continued, and there's been this kind of like long struggle and survival through really repressive conditions that really break down the solidarity between people, try to stop all forms of organization. And that's a kind of summary, we could say.
How has the ruling Justice and Development Party, the AKP of Erdogan, how have the policies of that party engaged in Bakur? And you sort of mentioned already that the government over the decades, but also more specifically with the current regime, has taken the opportunity of disaster capitalism to like in instances where there's a disruption like that attempted coup, consolidated power, or taken the war that they've engaged as an opportunity to also gentrify and internally displace Kurdish and other parts of the population in Bakur. But yeah, could you talk a little bit about that party's policy, and in particular in the aftermath of the devastating earthquakes that happened in February of this year?
Yeah, so AKP has been in power for more than 20 years now. And their policy and approach has changed massively in the last 20 years. So the kind of very earlier rhetoric was much more focused on a kind of like moderate conservatism. And they benefited quite a lot politically and economically from, you know, they did like massive infrastructure projects, and they adopted quite a lot of this like peace language. They also said they're like a party for the Kurds at the beginning, and they had the peace process, all these different things. But that has changed a lot into what is now a very, very repressive and increasingly conservative and also religiously conservative government. And just for example, one thing that we didn't cover earlier is that in the last 8 years, I guess, of AKP rule, every time the HDP would win local elections and they would have mayors, especially in the southeastern regions of Turkey, they would be automatically replaced by what is called Kayyum, which is like a trustee, basically a state-appointed trustee. And there's been huge records of misuse of funds of millions and millions by these Kayyums. And local people who were actually elected would then just be not even allowed to go into their office a lot of the time. And a lot of the time, these mayors would also be arrested, imprisoned. Sometimes MPs also, although there is parliamentary immunity, plenty of MPs have also gone to prison and are still carrying out sentences today, including the former leaders of the HDP. And also, actually, HDP now has a closure case. So the state has tried to completely make it illegal and say that it's a terrorist organization, that it has links to the PKK, that its members therefore must also be terrorists, etc. It didn't release the funds for HDP, and around 4,000 members are imprisoned. So yeah, it made it almost impossible really for that parliamentary party to actually continue its work, which is why Yeşil Sol Party came up and took the reins basically. But also AKP has shifted more and more towards extremely misogynistic approaches. So just an example, the Istanbul Convention in 2011 is something that was signed by many European states and Turkey. And it basically just provides like a kind of legal framework for like the bare minimum of women's rights in terms of like domestic violence, in terms of there being like vaguely state supported resources for them to use in these types of conditions. And yeah, just this kind of thing. And they actually have left that agreement despite the fact that Turkey was the first country to actually ratify it in Istanbul. And also we can see with the LGBTQ discourse that Erdogan has very outrightly said that the that LGBT people / movement is completely against the Turkish people. And also we heard that during COVID, the mosques would actually blast a message at some point blaming LGBT people for COVID and this type of thing. There's like a lot of different propaganda that happens, and Turkey is already in all of Europe and also what is considered Western Asia. There's a kind of like ridiculous also distinction between like how to even classify Europe, but we won't get into that now. But it's the second worst country on the Rainbow Index for LGBT rights. And yeah, as well as this, we can see massive media capture by Erdogan. So most media channels, the vast majority of the media is very closely linked to AKP, not just like the state, but actually specifically AKP itself. And that has happened over the course of his rule more and more, where they would buy up larger shares or like make larger political deals with the main media channels. And then we can see on the media itself that there's this kind of constant stream every day of, terrorists killed in operation, 12 more terrorists killed. And this is always related to the PKK. There's this kind of extreme demonization of guerrillas, but also actually just Kurdish people in general, and extreme nationalist rhetoric that has just ramped up and up and up. And we can see that the free press, in terms of all independent media, is massively attacked. This is not just Kurdish media, actually, it's any free press. There's many, many journalists imprisoned. And at different points that I've been in Bakur, sometimes there's been 24 journalists arrested at one time in a country in armed morning raids. And year on year, it's one of the highest, the Turkish state is one of the highest jails of journalists worldwide. And for example, we spoke to Jin News, a women's independent media outlet by the Kurdish movement, and they are on their 41st iteration of its website because it's constantly banned by the Turkish state, even though the actual media outlet itself is not prescribed. And there's always raids on their publishing houses, production companies, etc. But yeah, we also really need to emphasize that this like constant increasing repression is not only against Kurdish people, although it is very specifically, there is like a very deep anti-Kurdish rhetoric that is kind of essential actually to the Turkish state's integrity at this moment, it seems, in terms of its nationalism. But actually, AKP is against anyone who is in opposition to it, anyone who's against the dominant regime, or who they could conceptualize as undermining their hegemony from any political angle at all, because it's actually illegal to criticize the president or criticize the state. So yeah, we can kind of see this like extreme autocracy that's increased even just through these things. And we also saw how the nationalist platform is so important now more than ever possibly, and how it was so critical for the elections. In general, nationalism for all nation states, right, is a really important ideological platform to navigate and manipulate power and to reproduce the integrity of itself, like with its flag, like this like homogenous language, identity, etc. And also like terrorism is always related to statehood in some way, like the two things exist in relation to each other with how they're defined, how they're conceptualized. But these, like terrorists, as AKP calls them, are generally speaking teachers, lawyers, journalists, shepherds, rural workers, students. We're not just talking about guerrillas. We're talking about really anyone who might possibly be conceptualized as being critical of the state. And also we saw in the elections themselves how Erdogan massively ran on this nationalist platform, which we already knew would happen, but actually the opposition as well. At first he was saying, yes, I'm in like an alliance with Yeşil Sol Party, with the Kurds. I kind of want this more like equality, social democracy. And then he kind of, Kılıçdaroğlu, he kind of switched from this like chill grandfather to basically a fascist overnight on the 14th, where he then was like, yes, we're going to expel all of the refugees immediately. We have to get rid of terrorism, etc. Like very, very fast turn in his rhetoric, because they were like, okay, we have to appeal to the nationalist voters. And that's through this propagation of, how the media itself, how the judiciary, it's through the manipulation of the population through those channels that nationalism is itself so important and such like a pillar of people's consciousness. And of course, this is not just the case in Turkey. This is, of course, something that happens everywhere, but it's very intense there. And yeah, I'm going to pass to Katka.
Yeah, I think it's like also important to say explicitly that unfortunately Turkey is like a standard authoritarian regime. So, when media were reporting, for instance, about like elections and Erdogan won, so it might make it seem like, that it's something like we know from Western democracies that there will be elections or parties like in the way how we know them in Western democracies. But there's nothing like it. It's like, normal authoritarian regime. And even if you look, and there's no dispute about it, even like according to like standard measures, like there's this like Freedom House Index, which measures regimes across the world. And Turkey is classified as not free out of three categories that are not free, partly free, and free. Yeah. So even like when you think about it, let's not forget that even though we are talking about elections and, parties and stuff like this is in this context. So basically it's just like a facade. And Erdogan does it, and his regime does it like through all these examples that Hazel named. But I would like to also mention one like interesting thing, how the Turkish state, runs this like authoritarian machine, which basically functions through this mechanism of what is called state capture, which is basically kind of like a networks between private people, politicians, businessmen, and they use these networks, connections, and power and businesses to exploit the country, to exploit the public policy and use it for their own goals. And even in literature, Turkey would be used as like primary example case where this is, shown as like being done to really, really like a perfection, how they do it. And that on one hand is like, massive corruption, exploitation of the state. On the other hand, it also is not just like for, the oligarchs and politicians to become privately rich, but it serves the purpose of the political machine as well, right? So it's the way how also money get back to the system and allow the AKP and the regime to stay at power. And it's not a surprise that also Turkey scores in one of the like worst, in terms of the corruption indexes. And probably even worse because it's really hard to capture that, because the system, how they do it is also that they actually legalize a lot of things they do. So it's kind of like tailor-made laws that are put into the system, and everything kind of looks legal on the paper. So all this like oppression and persecution of the opposition or abuse of the public funds and this like whole system, how they run the machine on the paper is kind of legalized. So it's really also difficult to name it and to go after it. And this, in fact, is really, just to stop now. Should we answer, because we didn't plan on it, should we answer the earthquake or not now?
Yeah, I think that would be great. I mean, I think contextualizing all of that and the sort of this isn't the term it used, but crony capitalism kind of feels like a similar term to that, to the way that the Turkish state is operating in this manner. But yeah, if you could talk a little bit about not only like how they reacted to the earthquake, but some of the connections between the state capture and the way the AKP has been operating for the last 20 years, and how the level of devastation from the earthquake based on policies around construction quality and what companies were doing the construction. That would be great to tie in.
Yes, and this state capture machine is really a catastrophic testimony of like the situation with the earthquake, right? And shows how the regime operates, because actually the construction business is the primary example how and through which arena this operates. So the Erdogan's regime is mainly built on the construction business. So the government from 2002, they brought, the economic growth that they had since that time, not now and recent years, but before that, was mostly done by the investment into construction. And this was done in this, what you can imagine, these like nepotistic oligarchic networks of this construction, massive companies being connected to Erdogan's regime. They sending public money to have, this massive construction work being done in different areas across Turkey, including Kurdistan. One consequence here is that they would do this like massive displacement of people. So they would, tear down the existing settlements and replace them with like new, these buildings that have like really expensive apartments. It gives opportunity, to spend the public money and feed the machine. The second problem here was that even though people say that there were laws at place and measures and policies to ensure that it should follow the, earthquake things that need to be done when you construct in those areas, because that's nothing new, that earthquake was happening in those areas. And there is a history of earthquakes happening, in the region of Turkey and in that area in general. So this was well known, this was at place, but because of this, corruption, state capture machine, this was a lot of time totally not taken into account and intentionally not done. So what I've heard from people, for instance, was that they used cheaper, lower quality concrete to build this and that, because, that's what we want to do, boost the capitalist system of growth and start construction and building. So this came in turn back and totally, backfired when the earthquake happened, because a lot of these construction works were not done properly. Also, no one is probably going to be legally responsible for this, because as I said before, these tailor-made laws make it in a way that you basically can't complain to anyone. Yeah? So no one is legally responsible, accountable to those situations. And there has been in the past some attempts to take to the court people who were responsible for, the mismanagement and misbuilding of these construction buildings, but nothing happened and it goes nowhere. Another point that is really important here to mention related to the earthquake and how the regime operates is what is known as the earthquake tax. So it was a tax that that Turkey started collecting in 1999 in response to some, other earthquake that already happened before that in Izmir. And what they basically did is they introduced a new tax on the internet and mobile phone services to generate funds and build like a huge fund in case something like this happens in the future. So after, all of these years collecting this money, and when after adjusting it, some estimates say went to something close to like 30 billion pounds or something like this, they should have been in a position of having plenty of money, being ready to provide help, and act accordingly if something like this happens. As we saw, nothing like this happened at all, because it turned out that there were no money in this big pocket of, earthquake tax money that the regime, and this is not like any secret information, you can just Google it and it's like, even like finance ministers, the former finance ministers or employees from Turkish government would talk about it, that they use the money for different purposes. So they use them for infrastructure, they use the money to pay IMF, their loans and things like this. So basically, when the earthquake hit, it, I think, like really exposed how the regime functions and what it does badly and how it's corrupt and how it really in like very cynical way affects the lives of people on like everyday basis. So what we saw at that moment when the earthquake happened was that the Turkish regime did not react. We can speculate whether it was intention not to send help or whether it was basically paralysis and incompetency on their side. But yeah, the help was not there. The other thing that we saw was, on the other hand, massive help from the society. And I heard from different people that it was across, the political lines. So the grassroots help and help across Turkey was really massive, and people would really send money or travel to help in the earthquake areas. And they would not politicize it. No? But when the AKP came on the picture a few days after, people told us, but they showed up 4 days later, but they had cameras with them, and the first thing they cared about was that they're shooting, how they're shaking hands with the victims. So they would also, like the AKP regime, would politically abuse the situation. What is happening currently now, as far as we know, is that the people from those locations are safe. They would go to families, friends, or travel to different parts, because like the society is very much kind of like still communally running. So these people are somewhere, but the restructuring and rebuilding hasn't started and it hasn't been done in those places. And we don't know if there are any plans to do that. My worry is that if this will happen, it will go again in the same spirit how they had done it in the past, that it will be used by the regime to generate money, generate support, and also, further do this politics of displacement and like demographic manipulation of the region. Because like how Hazel talked about it already before, that's a long-term thing they are trying to do to change the demographic composition of the locality. And earthquake only contributes to that, right? So if there are refugees coming from this location, they're really trying hard that these people are not returned back. And for instance, a military base or military group somehow appears there and starts living in that region. And we also saw that when we were there doing the election monitoring, that people were shocked that they would see on the electoral lists like 50 new names of people who've never lived in that village, right? And that was those people who were installed by the Turkish regime that appeared there through this process. Hazel, do you have something else?
Not in like a big picture way. Just, I don't know if we should give like a very short bit of context so that listeners know like what actually happened with the earthquake. And I'm sure most people probably read the news, but otherwise for time we can just also move on.
I mean, if you quickly had the stats to throw out, just like the numbers are like a few instances of like, and the water supply in this area was, but if you don't have that, then yeah, we could move on and just put some links in the show notes to some articles.
Yeah, I can say just a really brief bit of context, because I spoke to a couple of people who volunteered there directly after the earthquake and what the situation really was. And, this earthquake was really unimaginable in terms of the actual destruction. More than 50,000 people were killed. The official number within Turkey is given as 50,000, but the people who live there say that actually the number was much, much higher. And a lot of people actually did survive under the rubble, but they weren't pulled out in time, and they couldn't be pulled out because they needed, heavy machinery or like specialist equipment, which didn't come. And so actually thousands and thousands of people froze to death because it was in the middle of winter. And the earthquake, the biggest one, the epicenter was in Elbistan, which is it's like also a mountainous area, and it's quite cold, especially in winter. It can be -20. And the other earthquake happened closer to the Syrian border in terms of the biggest ones. But yeah, basically because of the lack of response from the state, or from actually more than just local people and families that tried to dig out their relatives, thousands were unnecessarily killed. And yeah, the friends who we spoke to said that there was this like huge, there's a huge migration towards the cities within Turkey. Mostly people are internally displaced. They didn't leave internationally, but, we saw like people flying from all over the world to find their families. And most people lost a family member, if not entire families being killed. Because if you think of, in 50 years of war in the region, the official toll of how many people were killed in that war has been around 45,000. And there's at least 50,000 people that were killed in the earthquake in the matter of a couple of days. And when the bodies were still underneath the rubble, the state, after a period of time, they then came with the larger equipment and cleared away the house rubble, but without taking out the bodies. So many people still haven't recovered their relatives. They don't know where they are. They can't identify them or bury them. And yeah, as was said, this is also actually part of like a demographic change process. A lot of the areas were Alevi, which is a minority religion in the region. The Alevi areas have also particularly faced a lot of really deep discrimination by the state, a lot of war, and a lot of depopulation. And yeah, also, of course, Syria was affected too. So people are still dealing with the after effects of this in a very, very hard way.
Despite the terrible reaction by the government, by the last 20 years of cronyism that appears to have been developing that people seem aware of, Erdogan's AK party are celebrating a huge victory in national elections this year. What does this mean for Kurdish and other minoritized populations within the Turkish border? And by this, I mean, you can, speak to religious groups, to ethnic, linguistic groups, to what has been termed sometimes like gender minorities. But can you talk a bit about how other parties other than the AK did in that region, such as the HDP and their coalition that they're a part of, the YSP?
Yeah, so HDP didn't run in this election because they have a huge closure case by the state. More than 100 HDP politicians are being criminalized and sentenced to, in total, it's like hundreds and hundreds of years in prison, although that hasn't actually gone through yet. And because of the really harsh repression by the state, a new party was formed, Yeşil Sol Party. And actually, this has happened many times before. Many different parliamentary parties have been banned, and then a new one has sprung up to take its place. And they existed in a coalition also of other left parties. And to be honest, because of the really harsh conditions, like we can't see the election just as the day of voting itself, but we kind of have to look at the election in terms of, what were the conditions that actually produced it. It wasn't at all free or fair. And just actually whilst we were there, for example, on one day, about 130 people were arrested in dawn raids, mostly people who were active in the Yeşil Sol Party campaign. I think this was April 24th or 25th. And yeah, they were like journalists, lawyers in particular, campaign workers, cultural workers, and also directly before the second election, 182 campaign workers and friends of the Yeşil Sol Party were arrested in armed dawn raids. So, this is like a constant condition actually for the movement broadly, for especially any type of Kurdish organization. And yeah, because of this, the Yeşil Sol Party didn't get so high as HDP had done previously, but they still did quite well, considering, this party was 1 month old, basically, at the time of the election. There's a lot of different conditions where people can't run if they've had some kind of case in the courts. And, years of the trustee process, the Kayyum, destroying that connection between the local administrations actually being able to implement, HDP couldn't actually ever implement its policies in areas in a local sense because the trustee process cut that connection between the people and between administration. So yeah, despite this, they still managed to get quite a sizable percentage in parliament, and the local elections are also next year. So we'll see also how that goes. But it was really, very, very tough conditions for people.
So how do parties like the left parties actually relate to the Kurdish movement?
Yeah, so we can, I will use HDP or Yeşil Sol Party interchangeably. So the first thing to realize is that HDP's, their aim is not to take power and reproduce nation state power. So the understanding of why, the movement has the electoral party, so to say, is not that it's seen as a forefront for the struggle of Kurdistan freedom movement, but it's more like a pragmatic strategic tool that is, part and product of a bigger struggle. So the end goal is not to, go to the national parliamentary politics and to do laws, policies, and sit in the government. But it's basically the reason why the Kurdistan freedom movement has it is to stop the Turkish state from intervening into Kurdish autonomy and all these horrendous repression and genocide and the things that Hazel has talked about. So it's very utilitarian, but interestingly, it's not a cynical approach either. So the campaign or being HDP or Yeşil Sol is at the same time very genuine. And what I was personally shocked to see is also that we've seen it's really a grassroots party campaign type of politics. Yeah. So, and this also fits the general and broader movement's vision of free communal life, self-governance, and how we fight and how we struggle. So what we basically saw was not what we know, this professionalized party machine, but we were in very informal environment, movement-like type of things. It was composed a lot of from local activists. It wasn't this dehumanized, professional electoral machine, but very much kind of a DIY. It didn't have necessary hierarchies. It was one of the candidates was running. So for the time being, her cousin was the driver for the campaign trail and these things like that. So that would be another point that even though it's seen as this practical, pragmatic tool, it's still done in a genuine way. And another point that is, I think, important to mention is that the party is really in the society. So it really comes from the locality, from Bakur, from this region, but also from the Kurdistan freedom movement. So a lot of activists and the MPs or the people who run for the party are people with a history of working in the community. So there will be community organizers, people who were involved in democratic confederalist structures in the past when they were still allowed before the city wars, before the 2015 that Hazel talked about. It would be people who work with NGOs, who work with women's organizations, who were known from, village XYZ that they were doing this type of communal work there. So it's really people coming from the society. And when we were at we were there campaigning with them for almost 3 weeks. When we came to the villages with the campaign trail, what we saw was people super happy seeing old friends type of feeling, that they were cheering, they were shaking hands, saying hello, sharing tea. There was not much propaganda or persuading going on. It was really seen oh yeah, this party is growing out of what we've already been through, what we are struggling for. So it really felt as an integral part of the Kurdish society.
Yeah, in terms of how HDP and Yeşil Sol Party relate to the wider movement, as Katka said, they are actually just one other piece within this really huge ecosystem that exists of so many different forms of organization, but also actually a really common spirit and really common deep feeling of resistance. So, for example, when we're driving along the campaign trail on convoys through villages, kids would run out of the houses, super excited, and they would be making the victory sign. It's like the two fingers, like a peace sign. And this is a really important symbol, actually, of the anti-colonial resistance. And little kids en masse would also be doing this, shouting. And of course, like, we're not saying all people support HDP or Yeşil Sol Party. There's a lot of people who don't as well in the region, but they are also seen as like a actual representative of the people in many ways as well. And I think that's something that I want to also actually use an example from a currently unpublished interview that was made with Ceylan Akça, who is a parliamentarian. She was just voted in this recent election. And I think that this is a really beautiful quote because, you know, how HDP or Yeşil Sol Party, how this like parliamentary element fits within this broad struggle. It's also through generations and generations of like very strong resistance in many different conditions and through many different formats. Like, many people have lost somebody in the struggle. Many people have had family members or friends imprisoned. And this is like a kind of constant condition that people are living in. And she was asked in the interview that something we've witnessed is that people continue to struggle despite the conditions, that there is still hope, one that's grounded in absolute determination and resistance. After these elections, we saw a lot of despair in the streets. Where do people find the source and power to continue? And Ceylan said, I see my grandmother as a source of inspiration. She's been in the movement since the early 70s, and one story in particular is an inspiration to me. So one day, she was detained from her house in the village in the 90s. They took her to a torture chamber in Diyarbakır prison that was notorious at the time, electrifying her, beating her, pulling her nails out, interrogating her. Then they thought she was dead, so they threw her off a bridge and dumped her body in the mud. Later, some shepherds found her and put her in a horse-drawn cart. She spent 2 weeks in intensive care, and when she opens her eyes, the police came back and detained her again. They take her back to the prosecutor, and she goes to jail for 2 years. Now, she's 82, and she has a broken back, totally. She's really bent over, and she's strong like the first day. She goes to every rally, goes to every meeting in the village. If my grandmother didn't give up, then I can't give up. None of us can give up. Because we've had worse. We've all had worse, you know. Each one of us has to find our own motivations. I'm driven by my grandmother's fight, and I'll keep using that. And also, I think of my friends in prison. What could I do to get them out? Yeah, I think of prisons, that we should continue until we can't, and then others will take the reins. That's how resistance goes. It's just a perspective. If you look at the course of human history, nothing happens quickly. It's just a process of tiny accomplishments that accumulate to something bigger.
Serêkaniyê û Avaşîn şehreş Berlînê anîn Bavêtin ser can merda werxelê bizare doxmaqê Cerrê jon Tirko nefçekî hare henaran neyaran têne
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
1 2 1 2. Tune in for another episode of Marooncast. Marooncast is a down-to-earth black radical podcast for the people. Our host, hip-hop anarchist Simile the RBG, and sex educator and crochet artist KLC share their reflections on maroons, rebellions, womanism, life, culture, community, trap liberation, and everyday ratchetness. They deliver fresh commentary with a queer, transgender, non-conforming, fierce, funny, Southern girls, anti-imperialist, anti-oppression approach. Polyad and bullshit. Check out episodes of Marooncast on Channel Zero Network, Buzzsprout, SoundCloud, Google, Apple, and Spotify. All power to the people, all pleasure to the people. Peace.
You had mentioned, or sort of given a generalized history of democratic confederalism as a philosophy and just a little bit of how it's intertwined with the Kurdish movement. My understanding is that at some point, at least, HDP as a party had been engaging in some democratic confederalist structures, including co-mayors or co-representatives. I wonder if you could talk about that practice, and is that still an ongoing practice, or are there other things related to democratic confederalist structures that the HDP is engaging, or the other left parties?
Yeah, so HDP is involved in and was involved in that process as being one of the actors in the movement, but they are not like the ones who are driving it. You know? Even now when we ask people, so how do you see, when there was the vision for victory, how do you see this coming through? And people will be automatically saying that HDP is not the one who's going to bring democratic confederalism. This is what the people will do. And HDP, they have like more or less like a different role, but in the past they have been involved in it. So I don't know if this is commonly known, but actually the region of Bakur had democratic confederalist structure somewhere between 2000s, officially starting 2004 until 2015, the city wars that have been talked about. And that was something that the HDP was involved in, but they were involved in more kind of at this level of, delegate structure at the level of the region or level of the city and the higher levels. But basically, democratic confederalism, or the center and the heart of where this is happening, lies in the communal structure. So that lies in the local community, what in the structure is called local communes, which are geographically existing communities that kind of make sense, like a few streets of people who come from the same region or similar ethnicity, or, we are divided by a river, or we are a village. So that will be the local commune, plus some autonomous groups that live in that commune, like this autonomous organizing of women or autonomous organizing of youth. So all women or all youth are automatically embedded in those autonomous structures. So all the core of the democratic confederalist structure happens here at this local level. And here we don't have we have people coming in as I'm here for this party, or I am here to talk to you for the regional government or for the city. But the kind of core decision making and the main platform where the politics happens are these local structures. And we can imagine this is what basically is this grassroots participatory democracy, that happens at this level. People, there was this structure of people's houses that, HDP or, the other parties, the other party that was kind of another movement party that helped, support this process, is called the Democratic Regions Party. And they would somehow support this process, but basically this will happen in the community. They had this people's houses that the party might have helped to build, but it would be a community space where the locals would meet and, do the local democratic grassroots democracy, decision making and political participation. They would talk about all kinds of policies, how they want to decide things. The core idea is what already was mentioned, this democratic autonomy. So basically the logic of this is our life, this is our community, we decide for ourselves, and not only decide, but we also implement and make it happen for ourselves. So there is nothing waiting for someone from above or from somewhere else who will come to help us or at the same time oppress us, right? So this is what was happening there as a grassroots participatory democracy. The confederalist bit comes kind of like on top, where we see that, these communities need to somehow coordinate with one another. And that's the, where you would have delegates from those structures, from those like local communes, who would be delegates, not representatives. And they would meet at the higher level of assembly of the region or district in a city. And then you would have higher one, which would be at the city level. There would be again delegates, and this would be higher. And then potentially one day we can end up with world's democratic confederalist structure in this logic. But what is important here to keep in mind that there will never be these higher structures making any decisions or speaking for the super local, structures, for the communes. So the role of HDP in this kind of like a complex picture is that they come into play as one of the political groups, and because you would have also social movements, civil society organizations, women's groups, environmental groups, and they would come into the play at this like a city or regions level of communication. They would put through their suggestions, but they would never like impose or something on anyone else at these local communes. So in this perspective, I think it was important also to imagine that sometimes people would talk about the democratic confederalism in the logic of like, how we know it a little bit from the US Constitution, like checks and balances and vetoes and things like this. But basically, if we really take it seriously, then we see, but this is not really what is happening or what is needed, because there is no kind of like a higher level concentration of power, right? Because like these checks and balances are there to protect, the representative from usurping the power and the state. But here we don't really have the state. There is, no big player above these local communities. So we don't really need anything like this, like checks and balances. So we don't have the need to, that someone watches the watchman. So, and I think that's really like a true kind of like anti-hegemonic system of self-governance and grassroots democracy that was implemented there. And in this sense, it functioned like this. What is important and what you are saying, and this is also important to mention, that the coordination with the city and the elections, and especially regional elections and city level elections, are really important in that, and have been in the past. And there will be local elections next year that will be really important as well, because this is another vehicle that helps to support this, right? So at that point of time, there was a lot of resources and a lot of support coming from, for instance, mayor's office, where HDP / this other party, the Democratic Regions Party, would, run in those elections. They would, appropriate and use the city resources and infrastructure and the budgets to help democratic confederalism. And the logic how it would function then would be that they meet in the city assembly. So there would be these delegates of these local communes. And then, for instance, the elected mayor for the party would come to the assembly as well, but not as a head of that assembly or, someone who will be deciding something because he's in this elected position, but as another actor who is important in that. And actually the assembly would be the one who decides what's going to happen with, these types of funds or with this. And then the mayor's office would be kind of like one of the implementation tools that would be used to make the decisions happen.
And like in all of these structures and the ways that this is laid out, running through all of it, there's this very, very comprehensive ideology about how to build and reproduce a self-governing moral and political society that really runs on the principles of women's liberation and ecological society and this type of democracy that we were just talking about. And that is a process, it never reached this like final point of democratic confederalism was like truly actualized and life was free and blah, blah, blah. But it was really still in this process of struggle to create those things.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So that it's important. Yeah, that's a great point, Hazel, that it's like, we don't understand it in a way, we copy paste these structures on decision making and then we have democratic confederalism. It's much more that there is like the ideology and the other things around that make the mechanism work. Yeah.
That's really interesting. It seems so. Yeah, I guess civil society took the space that was left in a vacuum during the period of active war between ceasefires, and started actually creating structures that could resolve representation issues and allow for some administration. And it sounds like the political parties that have been operating recently in some ways are sort of not an afterthought, but as said before, maybe they're just like a placeholder or something to push back on the like escalations of violence by the state. I think that we've all had experience where people from social movements end up joining in with the power structure and are easily co-optable, so that they're, instead of speaking the words and ideas that are handed to them by the movement, they then start speaking on behalf of the movement and then on behalf of power to the population and the movement. And it seems like the structures are a byproduct of the activity of people getting together and communicating what their needs are, and then finding ways to express those to larger and larger areas and other groups of people, as opposed to an ideological model of representation that, God, I'm sorry, I'm having a lot of trouble trying to frame this, and maybe I just don't need to.
No, I think you are totally getting into the point that I like.
Yeah. Well, just skipping all the stuff that I said, because I think you said it better. So political parties are this pivot point of relationship between society or movement and the existing power structure. In this point, oftentimes represented as a colonial military and state apparatus. And the nature of political power is to centralize authority and wealth and political force or violence, I think. And so, not to say that Bakur has examples of, as Hazel said, like, it's not like it like reached the apex and suddenly was like perfect and everyone was free, but like, how does the movement or civil society keep the politicians that are in these parties that are helping to make this space from selling out democratic autonomy and just overwhelming or trying to make moves to overwhelm democratic confederalist structures? I mean, I guess since they're so dispersed and made up of neighborhood councils and all that, you can't really like populate those with your own people to have them make the decisions that blah, 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 that you want to see or that power wants to see. But are there any notable examples of recallability for people in those political parties if they start acting in opposition to concepts of democratic autonomy?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and always a question that I had when I was talking to people. So I think first part of the answer is that, like, as Hazel said, it's mostly the ideology. So what I and I think it's this like Western kind of positivist perspective on the governance structures, that it needs to be something predefined, right? And there are the rules, and then we fill the positions. But trying to get rid of this feeling, it's the other way around, right? There is no pre-existing ordering or how things are. People just come together and make decisions. And going back to what Hazel said, that's the ideology, right? That's the spirit. And people have that spirit. Like, autonomy as a spirit is like everywhere present. And that's the core principle, how people, navigate, according to which they navigate everything else. So basically, like, this idea of like, if you would say like in more like different ways, like this like multitude of people that, it's constantly politically engaging intersectionality of people in that local community. And that's what's the lived reality and normal conceptualization of politics in that region. Yeah. So no one even thinks about like that we should have this like static people represented by someone, whoever, because it's like, people are like, yeah, why would I speak for you? You know, this kind of like, why would I get into your business? Like, that's your business, you deal with that. So that's kind of like a very internalized and natural way how to conceptualize the life around in the region. So that's one thing that I think really, really helps. No? And this will override all rules or principles that we don't have to put in place because, you know, they can always be abused. So this kind of like, and the ideology of self-defense and struggle in the movement, that's exactly this type of thing, right? Because like, if someone has a problem, has a grievance, think they need to do something, self-defense is the answer. You are the one who will empower and free yourself. No one else can do it for you. So that's the main lead in this. And this helps, I think, very much culturally, you know, for the bad things not to happen that you described. The second answer is that there are a lot of like practices that people in the movement would do. What I heard from my respondents would be also, yeah, they just do protest against one another. No? So there was like at the beginning where the party took the municipality. So one of the respondents told me, you know, there were some deals that the previous mayors made with like big corporations. We did not like them. They were campaigning in some like environmental cause. We did not like them. The movement mayors were saying, we can't change it. So they would just stage a protest, right? And they kept protesting and they kept pushing and, you know, this kind of like permanent revolution inside as well. And they said, and it worked. Huh? And then we pushed enough and they changed and they reversed. And there is not this like an also naive idea of, and now everything will work perfectly and everyone is great and no one will ever abuse power. You know? So also knowledge of that and expecting that and being ready to raise your voice and stand up is really high in the movement or in the communities. So that's seen as something normal, you know, like opposing, criticizing. And also the ideology of the movement has this inbuilt structure of criticisms, of self-criticisms as one of the important mechanisms, how these things happen. And the last thing that, you know, the last kind of resort of things is like that also these parties are being elected, right? And so they would run these elections for the local municipality, you know, according to the Turkish law as well. But if they don't get, you know, votes, then okay, they lose the votes as well, right? So that there are different ways how this like power abuse or, you know, the power capture that we try to prevent from can happen in that community. What I think is interesting and important and crucial for kind of like protection of individuals. You know, sometimes we hear this like, but what if you happen to live in a local community that is very oppressive, right? And you might be a person whose lifestyle doesn't fit into that local community. And that's the moment where this intersectionality of these like autonomous organizing of women or youth, or it can be anything else, right? Of these like underprivileged, politically, you know, oppressed historically groups comes into play. So at this local level, you would have the local commune, but then you would have the separate autonomous organizing of women. So, but these women are also at the general structure, right? So the woman, if you happen to be a young woman, you basically kind of have like in our type of language, you have like free votes, you are there 3 times. And that's the mechanism how through this like self-organizing and self-defense, basically you also can protect yourself from the fact that you happen to live in a community that is, I don't know, anti-women or something like this.
Hazel, do you have anything?
Maybe just briefly, I think Katka, said it. It's just this thing of like, there's a lot of actually up and down power dynamics, and it's not only about, you know, within HDP, although it's present there, but within the entire movement, there's a lot of tensions, and these can be productive tensions as well. But it's not like there's like a general organizational culture of, although you may be a representative or have like this kind of somewhat like political power in that sense, actually that could turn upside down in a second, because there is this organizational methods that have been refined actually over a very long time to try and deal with these things internally, but also because of like the values of what it means to organize together and collectively, and how people can also very much check each other, and how one element of the movement actually just exists. It only really exists in relation to all of the others. So, you know, the parliamentary party can only really be effective or really represent the people as far as it actually exists in relation to, for example, Yeshua Sol party members, and this isn't because it wasn't like a cynical thing, you know, they were going to the vigils of the people who were disappeared by the state in the 90s. And this is a thing that many of the politicians do because also their own family members were also disappeared in the 90s. Or, you know, they might visit the graveyards where the martyrs are and this type of thing, which they will later be charged with terrorism for probably. But that's also not just like a kind of like a cynical way to maintain their power, but it's like, no, actually people are coming from those communities. Like it's from their villages that these people were killed or from their families that they were killed. So this is also how these things can kind of be checked, and that these power dynamics exist in relation to other very strong power dynamics like clan society, where you can have very, very large, quite hierarchical power dynamics in the clan society that in many ways actually can protect it from the capitalist state form of assimilation. And yeah, there can be a lot of benefits as well, and a lot of really beautiful things in clan society. And it can also be quite repressive in different ways as well. It's not like a binary between the two things. It's obviously like very complicated, but you know, there's like many other dynamics of actually also self-governance. Like in the clans also there's a collective form of economy in different ways, and there's collective values in different ways. And so a political party will actually only exist in relation to all of these other things anyway.
So incarceration is a common tool of counterinsurgency wielded against social movements and disenfranchised populations, including ethnic populations, for instance, in the USA, against Black and Indigenous populations, as well as leftists. In China, against Uyghur populations in Xinjiang, and in the occupied territories against Palestinians generally, and activists in particular by the Israeli government. Can you talk a bit about mass incarceration, what it looks like among Kurdish communities or other minoritized populations in Bakur in particular, and movements in so-called Turkey? And are there comparisons to be made between what in the US we call supermax prisons, or actually in the UK as well, and the F-type high security prisons that are in Turkey?
Yeah, so this is a really important question actually, because this shapes the political terrain so deeply in Turkey. And yeah, I guess I want to start by talking about how isolation, this is really related actually to the F-type prison system, but isolation is really a strategy that's critical to the state's repressive approach. And we can see that really crystallized in the F-type introduction. But like, firstly, I just want to say how, you know, the prison system is just one element of a kind of domestic securitization policy and approach by a state, because that also includes the military, it includes like the police more broadly, it includes surveillance, propaganda, it includes economic and judicial punishments that are like not carceral in the same way or don't involve detainment, but the thousands of people banned from working, like as teachers, for example. And, you know, there's like a lot to say about how rights are allowed or are taken away. And all of these are really important when considering how the state exerts and maintains its power. And yeah, this is also very important about how we talk about the legitimization of politics and what is kind of true, how we conceptualize truth, or something that's not true, especially when it relates to terrorism, which is the main charge that is levied against the Kurdish people and the Kurdish movement broadly. That could be membership of a terrorist organization, financing, propaganda, anything related to terrorism. And yeah, we can also talk more on that later because it's such a big topic, but like it's so deeply tied to how we like emotionally, psychologically, intellectually understand something that's political, or how leadership can actually be allowed in a kind of legal framework or not. So yeah, in general, for the movement, short detainment is a common thing. Like many people are arrested and then released pending the investigation. But it's also really not uncommon for people to go to prison for like 7, 14, even 30 years or life. And I've met, honestly, countless people that have been imprisoned for very long sentences. You know, 3 or 4 years is quite a short time there, a lot of the time for politically active people. And yeah, as I said earlier, most people have at least one martyr in their family and at least one person who's been imprisoned or who at least has had like a case or has a case. And many people actually have even more than 10 cases against them by the state. But the movement really grew up out of a prison resistance. So this isn't something that is stopping it. But of course, it's having a very difficult and brutal effects on people who are trying to organize. And when we're talking about isolation, first, just even thinking, where are the prisons? So very, very often, prisoners are placed in prisons that are incredibly far from their family members, from their towns or cities. They could be literally on the other side of the country. They could be moved frequently. And this is very difficult for people to visit their family members. So the isolation is already existing there. And more broadly, we can see this increase in isolation policy, not just in Turkey, but also in the West. This development of the architecture from like a ward system where maybe there's between 8 or 30 or even 50 prisoners that can kind of hang out, basically, like be together on some level, and organize their life actually collectively in this way. And we can see that in Britain, or in so-called Britain, there's been a change, especially after the 70s and 80s, towards a much more segregated form of a prison system. And, this is also actually off the back of a lot of prison riots and uprisings across many prisons in the 70s and 80s in England and Scotland. And so it makes sense that the state, to further its control and punishment over the lives of prisoners, would then segregate people from each other to break any form of solidarity that people can have with each other. And in Turkey, I also just want to say, actually, that the rate of incarceration has increased 5-fold since 2000. So it went from 73 incarcerated people per 100,000 in 2000 to 392 people per 1,000 now. And they're building at least 39 new prisons that are specially designed to isolate prisoners from each other. Although we're going to talk about the F-type a bit more specifically, actually, it's not the only type of prison that really segregates prisoners from each other, but there's also the S-type, and there's a few others as well, which all have thousands in their capacity. But the F-type has around 5,000 people imprisoned in it, at least. And it was introduced in 2000, and the political prisoners knew straight away that this was basically a form of warfare against them. So there was a huge resistance against this introduction, and masses of people went on death fasts, and hundreds of people died in this resistance against the F-type prisons. The military actually broke through the walls of prisons to destroy and attack the resistance. And people lost actually limbs, in this process, and were injured and were killed. And the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture actually agrees with the F-type introduction, which is not surprising because it's already been utilized in Europe as a method of control. Yeah, we can see that this is also very directly tied to Öcalan's isolation as well. So he is on literally a prison island with only a few other prisoners who are all completely separated from each other. For 27 months, he's had no contact with his lawyers, no contact with family, nothing. So there is also a lot of agitation, understandably, in the movement, because people don't know what is his situation. There's no way he can communicate with the world, and there's this complete block. And this type of isolation strategy is people often say that Imrali, this prison island, is like a laboratory for the other prisons. And these different methods of control get tested there and then utilized in the prisons actually in Turkey on the mainland. And then that is used also in society as well to isolate the politics of the Kurdish movement. There's a quote actually from Besime Konca, who was imprisoned for 16 years in Turkey. And then she was elected in 2015 as a HDP MP in Cerr, which is also in the Kurdish region. And she said, "Prison is the material manifestation of the state holding society hostage. Ideologically, the prison's mission is to render people meaningless, corrupt, and absurd. We view the prison as a space of enclosure by the state, a controlled and surveilled environment, deprived of creativity and spontaneity." And also in Turkey now, so there's about 1 million people who have conditions, so they might have to go and sign at the police station every week or every 2 weeks or something like that. There is literally arrests, dozens of arrests, if not hundreds, every single month. There's a general creation of a very, very deep creation of this atmosphere of fear and control. And that also counts for like infiltration of the movement, etc. And also, unfortunately, only family members can really be in contact with prisoners a lot of the time. So except from through letters or through lawyers, in terms of who can send prisoners money, only family members can, or else people can have cases and investigations opened against them. And so there's also Kurdish prisoners from Iran and Rojhelat, which is the eastern area of Kurdistan, who have nobody basically to support them because of these rules. And yeah, we can also see that obviously, and this is the case like for all prisons everywhere, that it's a method not just to punish the prisoners, but also society. And I just want to also mention there's 10,000 political prisoners, Kurdish political prisoners specifically, who are also being supported by a prisoner solidarity Tuadfed, which is also part of the democratic confederalist structure in the region. And yeah, this punishment it's really trying to break the solidarity, not just even between prisoners, but actually within society. So, how many parents will never see their children again for 30 years, or people who had kids and then will never see them grow up, people will never fall in love, people will never get married. These are like very, very long sentences, and for really thousands and thousands of people. And yeah, it's the point of prisons around the world to try and restrict and limit the scope of life without actually officially ending it. And we can see that this is part of like a mixed warfare strategy, because in other areas, there's this very explicit destruction of leaders. There's been assassinations in Rojava and in Bakur continuously, really, with drone strikes, with targeted MIT assassinations by the secret services against Kurdish leaders in civil society and also in armed forces. And just actually the other day, there was a administrator in Kamishlo who was killed by a drone strike on purpose. This is like a very physical form of the destruction of leaders in society, but actually the prison system as well, it also tries to destroy the leaders because it cuts them off from their ability to actually exist in society and for people to be in contact with them, and to drain the life and the freedom of that person from them. And this has a very harsh effect on HDP, but also actually on all forms of civil society organization.
Yeah, just a minor point to that you don't have to use, but I was thinking like the movement again turns this into like a positive thing as well. I mean, but not saying that like prison is something good or like romanticize it, but kind of use the terrible situation of what exists in like as best as they can. And it has really like important role in the, in the propaganda and the politicization. So especially in the past, and what Hazel talked about in the 80s. So people would usually talk about prison as the best university and best political education they could ever get. Yeah. And they really try hard not to separate the prison from the society. So it's like really a lot of work done in like not seeing them as someone or being on the margin or someone like out of society, but really prison is really like in everyday out of prison type of society. And as I said, it's very politicized. So it's like connected to this anti-state struggle, relates to like transformative justice conversations as well. And it's very creatively used like in the struggle and recruitment, right? So especially like in the 80s, it would be like, look, in seemingly like impossible situation of like solitary confinement or being in prison, the movement still found a way how to fight, how we can struggle. So it kind of gives this like, even if it seems, no one has done it before, or it seems super desperate, there's always some way how we can fight and how we can, flip it and turn and continue fighting in this way as well, even in situation like prison.
Yeah, actually the effectiveness of prison as a terrain of political organization and how this would really create universities for political consciousness is also the reason that the state rapidly introduced and proliferated the F-type and S-type prison system and the isolation regimes. But actually the majority of prisoners in Turkey are still held in the like T-type or the kind of ward systems. But F-type is also particularly used for political prisoners. And yeah, unfortunately their capacity is growing. But yeah, we also often see like people take a place of in organization still when they return, even after maybe 10 or 20 years of prison. They might go straight back into organizing. And people also like advance the language in prison, which is, Kamanji, for example, is not a standardized language. It's been very often unwritten because of the state repression and the assimilation policies. And actually, often prisoners are some of the people who have the most advanced level of really understanding and developing the language as well. And yeah, it's complicated.
I really appreciate that, and how you're talking about this as an important terrain of struggle, because that's exactly it's not only the opposite of what the repressive colonial forces want to happen to people when you put them into these sorts of dire circumstances, pulling them out of their at-home communities and relationships and careers and what have you, and whether it be into the dorm or ward style circumstances in the T-style prisons, or into the more isolated methods. If the purpose is, as you said, to break up community, then not only the work of the people on the inside to continue to stay connected as best they can with each other and with the outside movement, but the work on the outside of keeping them connected and welcoming them back and helping them work through the traumas that they've experienced on the inside is how you have a multi-generational culture of resistance. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, totally. And even just look at what Öcalan does when he puts on one man on one island. He doesn't go and cry and, be desperate. Well, I'm in prison for life. He actually uses that time to write most of his publications and do the ideological development for the movement and changes the whole paradigm of the movement through that, right? So this is also astonishing type of work or approach how to even conceptualize the prison.
Yeah, and it's okay if he does cry, because that's a terrible, terrible circumstance for him to be in. But, Öcalan's writing, which PM Press has been publishing a lot of translations of that, which is great, couldn't exist without the, cooperation of the wider movement that's getting access to that information, that's putting it into publication, that's spreading it. I don't know. The whole ecosystem of it, I think, is really beautiful.
Yeah, totally.
A couple of weeks ago, the KCK declared an end to the ceasefire that it had started after the earthquakes in February, as the Ankara government under Erdogan continues to escalate assaults in Bakur. Did you get the impression when you were touring around the elections that the escalating and continued conflicts, the election outcome, and the violence that was associated with the process of election season, or the lack of support for recovery following the earthquakes, have or will impact a flow of refugees from Bakur into the international diaspora?
I don't think so. I think that from what I've heard, it's mostly internally displaced people. But actually, the economic crisis is actually driving much more migration, I think, because so today, and I'm sorry, I didn't look at the dollar, but I looked at the pound and the lira, the Turkish lira to the pound. So let's say 1 year ago. Yeah, 1 year ago, it was £1 to 20 Turkish lira. Now it's £1 to 32 Turkish lira. And actually, in 2021, the lira lost 40% of its value. So I don't know what it was in 2020, but it's lost an incredible amount of its value, over and over and over again. And inflation peaked at around 86% a few months ago, but actually unofficial and independently researched forms of measuring inflation said that it was actually at its peak around 180%. So in terms of how people, especially young people, see their opportunities and how they can survive, and this is really for all people as well in the area, but of course this most impacts working class people. Yeah, it's a very, very difficult situation now economically, and I don't know how that will play out. I don't think any of us know exactly what will happen, but this was one of the hopes that people had with Erdogan if he had lost. And actually, as soon as he was elected again, the lira plummeted again. Should I say something about the escalations as well?
If you'd like. And when you're referring to internally displaced people, I mean, does that fall under like similar dynamics to the increasing urbanization of the population? Like, does that sort of fall under that push to get people out of the rural areas, or is that just something running in parallel and measured separately?
Yeah, so that is related actually, and I don't think that we can say it's the same as the 90s, which was very, very much a counter-revolutionary war method by the state to really drain the population from the rural areas. But actually, it is also having this effect in areas that have already been depopulated, and people who are already suffering from the effects of war. And a lot of people moved actually both west and east in Turkey and in Kurdistan to stay with their families and this kind of thing. And rent prices doubled or even tripled in some places, including in Ahmed, which is Diyarbakir. And in terms of escalations more broadly as well, of course, we don't know, we can't say for sure what will happen, but unfortunately, actually, a lot of the people who we met will probably have many court cases from the actual election campaigning that they did. And this repression is certain to not stop or massively decrease at any point. The day after the second election, a couple dozen people were arrested in dawn raids in Hakkari, which is the southeastern, like very, very southeastern region in Bakur. And somebody was beaten to the point of hospitalization in that. And, this is just like one example of the type of policy that AKP already does. It's not like this isn't like a new thing, but these types of attacks, the drone strikes in Rojava, attacks in the mountains in Bashur, setting up military bases, trying to destroy the civil society organizations and political organizations. These things will undoubtedly continue, and they will also undoubtedly be resisted as well. But also otherwise, so Hudapar is it's like a Kurdish, very far-right Islamist organization who has, it's got like an active wing of Hezbollah, but it's not related to the other forms of Hezbollah that are active in other countries. This party actually aligned with AKP and Hezbollah. They had a active part in the counter-revolutionary activities with the secret services in the 90s, where many Kurdish movement people were assassinated in the rural areas, in the cities. Many journalists were shot and assassinated. Hezbollah is actually being welcomed into local administrations by AKP and alliances. And this is also seen as the shift towards this much, much more conservative, like social policy. As I mentioned earlier, like the withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention and stuff like that. And anti-LGBT propaganda. It's quite like a worrying development. There was more than 50 Hezbollah members that were convicted for murders in the 90s. They were released over the last 3 years after Hudapar made these political agreements with AKP. And of course, Erdogan will want to invade Rojava, but whether or not he actually can, we don't know. Already, actually, a very large region of it has been occupied by the Turkish state, and there's a large amount of demographic replacement happening there as well. But essentially, world geopolitical relationships really do mediate these, people's lives in a very horrible way. So actually, whether Russia, Israel, the US, Britain, like whether these militaries and nation states will actually allow Erdogan to invade, we don't know. It's unlikely because of the oil extraction, basically. But I really wish actually that there was more that I could say that felt really, I know we're talking about the escalations and stuff, but it's very, very bleak. And it is a really unfortunate and very scary reality for people that it is 5 more years of Erdogan. But because of the economy being so destroyed by his policies, I mean, maybe he also can't survive as a politician for 5 years. We also don't know.
So just a brief aside, well, not a full aside, like meant for the conversation, but I know that one of the things over the last 4 or 5 years that the AKP has been doing in terms of Rojava has been cutting off water access. Is that a thing that's affecting parts of Bakur? Is there a relationship there between that policy of allowing water to actually cross the border there into Syria and access to water coming into Bakur?
Yeah, so there is a relationship there, because, for example, a lot of the dam building projects, they're actually in Bakur. So these things that are colonial and capitalist actions by the state in Bakur have these longer downstream effects, basically in Rojava. And for example, when Hasankeyf was flooded, it's a like very historic site that's thousands of years old. There's like many different projects that it doesn't necessarily have the same effect because the water scarcity in Rojava is like very severe. Whereas in Bakur, it's a different situation. It's not as dry in many places. It's also still incredibly hot, and there are a lot of ecological issues, but a lot of the actions have either further downstream effects or there's like this cultural, historic destruction that takes place. So yeah, destroying these ancient sites, or also flooding a lot of areas that people are living in Dersim, which is also called Tunceli in Turkish, which is a very, very strong area of resistance historically and presently. And this is a predominantly a levee area as well, which means that a lot of like sacred sites, but actually connected to like trees and like places in nature. A lot of these places have been destroyed, and there's been huge dam building projects there. But actually the local organizations and the movement also has been struggling against these type of ecocidal projects with mixed success. Actually, they have also managed to stop some of these. But yeah, the effects are a bit different, but it is connected.
So Turkey is a member state of NATO, which also includes the USA and the UK, in case any of the listening audience didn't know. The PKK is a proscribed group according to the Terrorism Act of 2000 in the UK. It's also on a list of terrorist organizations held by the State Department in the US. But obviously the PKK isn't the only element of the Kurdish freedom movement. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what happens with people who organize in the Kurdish diaspora in the UK, or with organizations that the Turkish state considers oppositional, like the HDP.
Yeah, so this is also a very big topic, and we can see through the use of the Terrorism Act 2000, and specifically the use of Schedule 7, how this alliance between these colonial international forces can like utilize the laws to mostly actually exchange data. It's not so often used to prosecute people, but actually this is a very important harassment and surveillance tool. And mostly Schedule 7. So this is a thing that's used at borders in Britain, and it's like a special counterterrorism law that means that if you enter, you can be stopped, detained for up to 6 hours without a right to silence. So you can't say no comment or anything like that, because you'd be breaking the law then. And also the state has a right to all of your technology and also the passwords to your technology, or else you could also be prosecuted, which could have a 2-year jail sentence. And yeah, as I said, it's mostly used to collect data, but it's predominantly used against Black and brown people and diasporic communities. And it's been criticized many times by different organizations, different community organizations. Actually, in April, a Labour MP in the UK said that he tabled a motion in Parliament, and it calls for an urgent review to ensure that Schedule 7 powers are not being abused to suppress democratic and human rights and criminalise political dissent in the UK or overseas. Because there has always been a use of this law, but actually in the last few months we've seen this also increased against internationalists. It's very commonly used against the Kurdish diaspora. And this, I also want to step back and again look at terrorism and the concept of it in this much broader political context around delegitimization. So actually I was stopped under Schedule 7 as well when I returned. And they asked me many questions for hours about everything, about my life, about my politics, all of this kind of thing. And they took my technology, which they haven't given back. But, they also asked me, what do you think about Abdullah Öcalan? And they asked me, what do I think about the PKK? What do I think about all these different things? What do I know about the HDP? And this kind of thing. And they looked actually at my notebook, which has a list of Kurdish vocabulary in it. And one of the things that they asked me about was, public prosecutor's court. That's very specialist language, isn't it? And I was like, well, not really, because, HDP actually calls for international delegations, many of whom are actually parliamentarians themselves who attend these. And HDP is being criminalized and made illegal in the court in Turkey by the public prosecutor's court. So it's not really specialist if you look at it like that. But, it was a very kind of like, it kind of reminded me actually of how even like Kurdish language itself is somehow made this, like, somehow they're trying to relate it to terrorism itself. It's very, very messed up. And, actually still in Turkey, Kurdish isn't an official language by the state, and it's still really brutally suppressed. Yeah, so in terms of also like why Schedule 7 might be used in this context, I think that we have to look at Britain and Turkey's relationship. And they do have very close political ties. And usually people in Europe, they might say, oh, well, Turkey and Germany have really close political ties, which is also true. But actually, Britain in general tries to support Turkey and also AKP in any way that it can. They have quite a lot of trade. They have a possible $10 billion arms deal on the horizon that hasn't been secured yet. But I think it's much more significant to really think about the political power that both states are trying to utilize for their own benefit. And Turkey is positioned very importantly in Europe, in the Middle East, between Russia and the West, like in the Ukraine war. And also, really significantly, it is the biggest host of refugees worldwide. There's about 4 million people there as refugees, and the British state has given at least £3 million, but actually it's much more, for securitization of an eastern border with Iran. So in the last few years, they've built this huge border wall. They have like very specialist equipment, like sensing and surveillance equipment. They've also actually trained their military in relation to this securitization practice as well. And, this is the kind of thing that like Western imperialist states actually do very often around the world. It's not the first time, but we can see this type of policy and practice around securitization, how this can span from the political desires of one side of the continent to the other. And Turkey gets a lot of money from the EU for hosting the refugees. And Erdogan is always using people's lives as a bargaining chip. He once threatened to open the gate in relation to the people who've claimed asylum there to Europe if they didn't support his invasion of northeast Syria. Schedule 7 is used for like many different political alignments, not just one. But we can see this as like one method within this broad securitization strategy, and especially how borders are like this quite important crystallization of state power.
No, I think it's just like, this, I mean, it's not surprising for any of your listeners probably, but like just to, keep realizing the paradox of it, how this like counter-terrorist and terrorist language is used totally flipped upside down. Like before we went here, Hazel and I were joking that, but imagine like, because it's like, Turkey, authoritarian state, they have opposition that is like the democratic opposition. They call them terrorists. And because of all these other things that Hazel mentioned, now, all the other NATO and other countries start calling them terrorists as well. And we were just joking that imagine if there was like a lot of oil in Bakur, like we would see completely different development, right? It would be like US would be invading Turkey and putting down Erdogan as this like terrible authoritarian leader, and would be trying to co-opt the Kurdistan freedom movement and the grassroots democracy as like something that is aligned with like, the democratic values of the world and blah, blah, blah.
Well, that does raise an interesting question that I would love to hear if you have a response to it, is that so the U.S. government has had a relationship with the administration in Rojava at various points, working militarily or offering to have advisors or providing some armaments or air support at times during the battles against Daesh, right? ISIS. And there is in some people's framework of how they, like some Western leftists and how they view the world, they view that any sort of tie with a government like the UK or like the US, it becomes an uncomplicated situation where they must therefore be a tool or a stooge of imperialism. I don't know. You may not want to talk about it, but I wonder if that's a thing that's worth pushing back on or just ignoring.
I mean, I personally usually don't engage with it, because one thing that I see a lot with the Kurdish movement from, in like Western leftist circles, but also beyond that actually, is people project a lot of different things onto it. So, you know, you have people who are like, oh, the Kurdish movement is just like a Stalinist, I don't know, tyrannical dictatorship by Öcalan. And then you have people who are like, the Kurdish movement is like an anarchist paradise. And then there's people that say, well, actually, Rojava is just a proxy for Assad. And then people say, well, Rojava is just a proxy for the US. You know, I've seen all of these things actually a lot and more. And I think that they're all wrong. And it's a very, very complicated dynamic of power relations. And of course, the US is a huge, huge imperialist colonial state that tries to maintain its hegemony however it can in any part of the world. Like, we know that, of course. And the movement knows that too. You know, the movement doesn't idealize the US or think that the US is like a true democracy and like its true friend and blah, blah. Like, that's just not the case. And yeah, I think it's quite sad that people can't really see the kind of corner actually that the movement is in there in terms of the non-state existence of it, and therefore complete non-existence in a legal framework and like protection sense, surrounded by hostile nation states and very powerful armies. And, you know, people know that the US is hungry for oil in the region, and that's what they're doing. But also, Rojava is at like constant threat of being destroyed. And we say Rojava because it's like saying the place, but it's actually millions of people's lives in the region who actually just want to live a peaceful life. And yeah, I think it's quite shitty when people try to project this assimilation, I guess, into that imperialism that I don't actually think exists.
Yeah, I think you said it nicely. I think it's like, for me personally, like, I mean, those are difficult things to go through and the complexities. And yeah, I might be guilty of some of the projections as well. But what I personally actually learned from the Kurdistan freedom movement in my own organizing is like the pragmatism, and that it's two separate things, and strategy and pragmatism is one thing. And another thing is like the principles and the revolution. And we constantly need to negotiate where the things stand, right? So for me, this would be like, I would bring it like also in example of like, I don't know, me as an like animal liberation vegan person, there is like some indigenous struggle and those people are not vegan. So am I not going to support them? Or, you know, the similar type of question, like, or like in this case. So I think, yeah, there is a lot of like a positivist Western idea of this like purism and perfectionism, and like asking for, you know, movement like this, like, yeah, for this, our purist perfectionist like ideals. Now what are the like practical living alternatives that they have, right? You stop and cease to exist because the powers in the world are like this. I think that's quite like, yeah. And I think like people don't think that's really true when they suggest something like this. I'll think about that. But I'm like, as I said, I'm also like guilty myself of these things. So what I'm personally learning from this is like, yeah, the pragmatism in political struggle that we can disagree and agree with like specific steps, right? But that it's something that is also ideologically in there in Kurdistan freedom movement as like part of the reality that we live.
Yeah, I just also want to add that there's so many different contradictions and pragmatisms that have to be made that actually are like very, very, very challenging for people in the movement, because there's many examples actually of, you know, like honor killings happening within a community, and some of the local communes maybe, or like women's civil society organizations becoming involved in these processes of accountability and justice. And, you know, that for like many people, of course, is like a red line, or there's many different things that can be politically incredibly challenging and completely against the ethics that the movement has. But people exist, the society exists, we all exist actually already in a context that's fraught with very tough contradictions. Like, we can't just decide to be in an ideal, and the movement only exists from the society anyway, like within it and as it. It's not an elite like few people. It's something that's kind of always working in this pragmatic framework to try and move through these contradictions. And, you know, Öcalan's ideology, his theory and philosophy places capitalist modernity as the worst, like most extreme terrain of inequalities and oppressions that humans have ever existed in. And he certainly sees the Western and also, US, etc., positions within that to have created that and perpetuated it. But it just doesn't stop there, It's not like, it's only like these states that are the actors in it, but there's like many long trajectories of power and also like resistance that he highlights. So,
well, thank you for letting me kind of jump that question on you all. Well, are there any, and I really appreciate the candor and the quality of the information that you've shared. Are there any English language sources on organizing and like that express and translate the work of folks and the thoughts of folks that are in Bakur who are doing work in the Kurdish movement that you'd suggest pointing people to?
Yeah, totally. So there's a few books, and we can send you the links as well to put in the show notes maybe. So one of the best ones actually is Dila Dirik's book, The Kurdish Women's Movement. In my opinion, this is like the best English language resource that exists to learn about the Kurdish freedom movement's ideology and practice and history broadly. But also, especially about Bakur, there's a book that was recently released called The Purple Colour of Kurdish Politics, Women Politicians Write from Prison. And it's edited by Gultan Kishanak and is available online in the US and also in the UK and hopefully internationally. And she actually has letters from women who have worked in the political field in Turkey and Bakur. And they talk, most of them are like HDP MPs or mayors and like this kind of thing. And they speak about their process through politicization and their activities. And it's really, really amazing book. But otherwise, also, I really recommend Öcalan's books, actually, although he doesn't, he's not talking like about the recent history of Bakur. I think that they're really, really worth reading. And if you haven't, some of them are quite long, but there are also the booklets that are available for like £1 or £2 and also online as free PDFs. And I really recommend reading, for example, Democratic Nation or Liberating Life, Women's Revolution, for getting the kind of background information on some of the stuff that we spoke about. But also otherwise, there's actually a lot of conferences that are organized by the movement, and we can send some links to put in the show notes. People can also go to protests that have been organized by the diaspora or by the internationalist organizations in your cities if they have some basis there. And there's also a few different films. So a really important one is called 14th of July, 14th Temmuz, which is about the prison struggle in Diyarbakir prison in the military coup era. And there's English subtitles for it. It's in Turkish, but it's got English subtitles. And yeah, I think like most importantly, organizing and struggling in your own locality is like the kind of thing I would suggest, if it's not like a resource, but in terms of how can people like support the movement and this type of thing, I think this is one of the best ways also to do it. And I'll pass to Katka.
Yeah, just to like when we went there and asked people, how can we help? Oftentimes the answer is do revolution in your back home as well. So yeah, go ahead and let's do the revolution in our localities. There are other ways like how people can like actively support. There are campaigns that, where you can support the struggle or defend the Kurdistan revolution. So we will put links to that. There is a campaign called Delist the PKK, and it's like a petition campaign, and that's been going for years, and other things around that as well. And another campaign is Freedom for Öcalan, which is again a campaign, where you can sign it, and yeah, it's like international, and yeah, we will put a link to that as well. And if people have money or wanna, support with donations, then we would recommend that you send your money to Avaşîn, which is all locally helping organizations of the victims of the earthquake. So they have like an international account, and you can send the money to them, and we can assure you that this money will go actually really to these regions that are cut out of like other support, and the money will support the victims of the earthquake in the region, especially in Bakur.
Katka and Hazel, thank you so much for having this conversation.
Thank you for having us here.
Thank you so much for having us. One last thing, we will also post a contact on us. We've also written a report from have other sources. So if people want to get in touch and have ideas, criticisms, want to talk, get involved, please, contact us, and we will be super happy, to be in touch. Thank you.
This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books. Located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville, Firestorm Books is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.